Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We've got another handful of great sessions lined up for this afternoon, and then we have the closing keynote tomorrow afternoon. So thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Chrysler. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on staff here at the Wyoming Arts Council as the folklorist and health and wellness in the arts specialist. We have also been providing physical descriptions of ourselves to improve accessibility at this event. So I'm a white man in my early 30s. I'm wearing a blue flannel shirt and I have short brown hair. Just a couple housekeeping notes. We've sort of gone over these a few times now over this week, but I'll just sort of hit the highlights here again. Do whatever you need to do to stay engaged as possible throughout the afternoon. So feel free to take a break or go get some water if you need that. We will be recording the sessions today, and so those will be made available in the future as well. If you would like captions, we do have Zoom's live transcription feature enabled. And so you can turn the captions on. If you go down to the bottom of the screen, there should be a button that says CC live transcript. And you can just press that and access the captions in that way. For today's session, I would encourage everybody to turn their camera on as you feel comfortable doing so. Try to stay muted when not speaking. We will have a Q&A at the end of this first session. So feel free to make use of the chat function, and you can also use the raise hand function as well to ask a question. Okay, I now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today's first session, which is entitled Native Arts and Culture, Resilience, Reclamation, and Relevance. Native sacred places, lifeways, and traditions have shaped this land since time immemorial, and Indigenous people continue to create, share, and inspire despite centuries of colonization. An essential component of justice for Native peoples is the value attributed to our arts and humanities. Lifting contemporary artistic expressions after generations of attempted erasure and reclaiming languages, cultures, and histories are necessary to advance equity for Native communities. And the speaker for this session is Barbara Mumby-Huerta, who is Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. And I feel really fortunate for us to have her here with us today. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Barbara.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, great. And I want to make sure, there we go. Okay, thank you again, Josh, and I'm very humbled and honored to be here today to represent the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. My visual description, I'm a light-complected, mixed-race, Native American female. My pronouns are she and her. I have long, dark, curly hair. I wear dark glasses, and I have dark brown eyes. And I'm sitting in front of a blurred, clear background. A little bit about who I am. For my mother's people, I belong to the Powhatan Confederacy, which originated along the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay in the place that we now know as Virginia. Originally, this area was made up of 30 distinct tribes. Only 8 are recognized by the state of Virginia today. From these 8, I descend specifically from the Patawomack, Pamunkey, and Mattaponi peoples. And of course, due to a series of forced relocations, we were pushed westward, and our family migrated first through North Carolina and Tennessee and Texas and Oklahoma, where my maternal grandparents landed in the rural Central Valley of California as part of the Great Migration and joined the encampments of migrant farm workers where my mother was born. My father was both a first generation and a descendant of the Concow Maidu from the northern part of California's Central Valley. His maternal line was severely impacted by the state-sanctioned genocide against California Indians. as well as termination policies that in essence erased many Native people while severing their connections to the land and culture. Through my heritage and experiences growing up in a rural farming community, the arts became a powerful tool for my own survival, healing, connecting, and communicating. As such, I'm a practicing visual artist as well as an arts administrator. But prior to joining the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, I was the director of community investments for the San Francisco Arts Commission, where I oversaw their 4 cultural centers, their grant making, arts education, and arts licensing programs. I'm also an Open Society Racial Equality Fellow, where I'm working with the community to develop a framework and toolkit to support the assessment, recontextualization, and removals of contested public art. But today I'm here to share with you the Native Arts and Cultures Resilience, Reclamation, and Relevance report, and all of the inspiring efforts of Native peoples to share their truths and experiences, to infiltrate affluent institutions of power, and to advocate for more resources within the arts and cultures sector. So a little bit about who Native Arts and Cultures Foundation is. We are a national nonprofit philanthropic organization that's dedicated exclusively to the revitalization, appreciation, and perpetuation of Indigenous arts and cultures. We were founded in 2007 in response to a nationwide feasibility study funded by the Ford Foundation that explored the creation of new philanthropic resources to support the arts and cultures of American Indian people, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. This effort was led by the Ford Foundation's program officer, Betsy Theobald Richards, with a circle of advisors that included Walter Echohawk and the poet Joy Harjo. So we are primarily Native-led and national in scope. We support federally and state recognized American Indian, Native Hawaiians, and Alaska Native artists and communities through our grant making, convening, and advocacy. Our work and trajectory has shifted dramatically over the past year as we were gifted a building which roots us in the Portland metro area. We are in the process of expanding our programming to include presenting and exhibiting artists, and I'll speak more about this a little later in the presentation. So in 2015, the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation began dialogue with the NEA about the need for more collaboration among federal agencies and Native organizations, leaders, artists, and cultural bearers. These discussions and gatherings there had been discussions and gatherings with federal agencies and Native communities in the other sectors for decades, but never specifically around arts and culture. So it was believed that there was a need for more coordination and learning between the federal cultural agencies and Native communities, and this would lead to a greater mutual understanding and a more robust Native arts and cultures ecology. So at the prompting of our organization's leadership, as well as First Peoples Fund, the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, and other national Native-led organizations, the NEA began a multi-year process or a listening tour throughout tribal governments and communities to learn more about their needs. The efforts to visit, listen, and learn from the communities, as well as the change in the federal administration in 2016, was the spark that ignited the planning around a national convening of Indigenous arts and cultures leaders that took place in February of 2020, right before the pandemic. And this gathering was entitled Native Arts and Culture, Resilience, Reclamation, and Relevance. So Indigenous artists and leaders converged in Washington, D.C. and spent several days listening and learning and interacting with one another. They were bound by an understanding of cross-cultural respect and reciprocity and shaping constructive relationships and narratives while providing groundwork for a better understanding of Native peoples. It should be noted that there is no Native monolith. In the US alone, there are over 574 federally recognized tribes, speaking over 150 languages and dialects, each with very distinct cultural practices, citizenship criteria, and specific rights to unceded territories. So in addition to these tribes, there are also 560,000 state recognized Native Hawaiians living in Hawaii and the continental USA. And there are also state recognized tribes, unrecognized tribes, a myriad of uncounted and undocumented Native people, people with complex mixed heritage, and a wide range of Indigenous people living in the US from throughout the Americas. So this diversity lends to those complexities of developing understanding of and working with tribal communities. So I went too far. So the Native Arts and Cultures gathering, it was unique, and it was in a sense a gathering of nations. It brought together over 225 attendees that represented more than 40 tribal nations. And there are representatives from over a dozen federal, state, and regional entities, and Native artists, students, and nonprofit professionals, and philanthropic funders. So the convening included an opening ceremony, welcoming remarks, a keynote address from National Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, 3 sets of concurrent panel sessions that were interspersed with performances, and a closing session to gather conference takeaways and give thanks to all of those who planned and participated in the gathering. So the learning was synthesized into 3 foundational recommendations that you see here. So first is the ability of Native peoples to tell our own stories about ourselves, our history, and the history of the US, and to have those stories heard and amplified are vital to our own survival and well-being. Also, Native leadership and voice are needed in positions of influence and decision-making to shift institutional power, perspectives, and practices. And finally, that the equitable and decolonized resourcing of Native artists, culture bearers, and organizations for self-determined cultural production and infrastructure building is necessary for the advancement of Native justice. So each recommendation was also accompanied by a series of specific efforts that, if enacted, the participants felt would result in a more robust and equitable future for Native arts and cultures. In the following slides, I'll break down each of these recommendations and share some specific examples of how the Native community is currently working to enact those recommendations. So empowering Indigenous communities to tell their own story is what advances truth-telling while shifting the narratives about Native peoples. So opportunities to come together to decolonize Western methods of evaluation and to determine how and what our communities want to learn, as well as share with the world, are necessary to lift our stories and experiences, as well as measure the impacts that art and culture has upon Native peoples. So one example of convening the field to build relationships and share knowledge is an upcoming national conference hosted by the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. We believe that arts and creativity are a powerful force to catalyze positive transformational change, as well as provide protection to those traditions and practices that need to be preserved. So from September 14th through 16th of next year, we will host our first biennial national conference here in Portland, Oregon. The planning for this convening has been directly informed by the conversations and recommendations that came out of the Resilience, Reclamation, and Relevance convening, as well as from research and stakeholder focus groups that we conducted. So we all agree that the time has come for a more significant mobilization of Native artists, voices, and creative minds to contribute to discussions and problem solving around the pressing issues affecting the lives of many Native peoples in their homelands and as global citizens. So prolonged challenges like the pandemic, climate change, and racial inequities in our country need persistent energy, rigor, and solutions. So this convening will aim to inspire creative approaches to these challenges while centering the voices of intergenerational Native artists and cultural bearers. So an example of Native-driven and defined research is the Reclaiming Native Truth project. This project was an unprecedented 2-year multi-million-dollar research and strategy setting initiative that was co-designed and led by Illuminati founder Crystal Echohawk and her firm Echohawk Consulting. The project resulted in comprehensive data and learning about the challenges and opportunities that Native Americans face in educating other Americans while changing public perceptions. The findings indicate that the invisibility of and toxic misconceptions about Native peoples create very serious biases among diverse demographics and institutions, including the courts, Congress, philanthropy, and other sectors. So invisibility perpetuated in pop culture, the media, as well as K-12 education is one of the biggest drivers behind this endemic bias. So findings show how invisibility, erasure, stereotypes, and false narratives underline the stories being told right now about Native people in the 21st century. And that many Americans are informed by stereotypes and myths that all Native Americans receive federal government benefits and are enriching themselves off of tribal gaming. However, the research also illuminated pathways forward. Of those polled, 78% are interested in learning more about Native cultures, and that strong majority support Native positions on most issues. And 72% support significant changes to the K-12 curricula to ensure that accurate Native history and culture is taught in schools. So First Nations Development Institute's Native Language Immersion Initiative builds on its longtime efforts to support the revitalization and perpetuation of Native languages, and supports the recommendations to develop and disseminate education materials from a Native perspective. Language, as we know, is a vital asset for Native people and communities. And language immersion programs have been recognized as providing key benefits to Native communities by boosting educational achievement and student retention rates. They also support the community identity, Native systems of kinship, and management of community, cultural, and natural resources. So First Nations Development Institute has provided 25 grants totaling more than $2.1 million to support Native language programs throughout the nation. So their report is available on their website and includes the initial results of their initiative, along with stories about Native strength, resilience, and hope. So for the second recommendation, the desire is to support the development of Native leaders and their appointments to decision-making positions in public agencies and cultural institutions. In this way, policies and programs will be informed by Native peoples. On the national front, we have witnessed the historical appointment of Senator Deb Haaland to Cabinet Secretary in the Biden administration. So in the arts and cultural sector, some equally exciting appointments have been made to increase Native representation and shift the power balance. First and foremost is most recently Shelley Lowe, who is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation and grew up in Granada, Arizona. She is the first Native American selected to lead the NEH and only the second woman. She is also was the executive director of the Harvard University Native American program prior to her NEH nomination. She was also the assistant dean for Native American Affairs at the Yale College Dean's Office and director of the Native American Cultural Center at Yale University. So prior to her position at Yale, she spent 6 years as the graduate education program facilitator for the American Indian Studies program at the University of Arizona. So during her time at the University of Arizona, she was involved in the Native American Student Affairs Office and the American Indian Alumni Club. She has presented and published in the field of American Indian higher education and is currently completing her doctorate in higher education with a focus on American Indian student success. And in January of this year, 42-year-old Arizona State University associate professor, as well as a MacArthur Fellow, Natalie Diaz, became the youngest chancellor ever elected to the Academy of American Poets. Diaz's election to the Academy also marks the first time the Board of Chancellors comprise a majority of poets of color, as well as a majority of women. Natalie's enrolled in the Gia River Indian community and grew up in the Fort Mojave Reservation that straddles the border of California, Arizona, and Nevada. She's called a language activist and speaks Mojave, Spanish, and English, which is reflected in her poems. And she calls attention to language in her poetry and in her efforts to preserve her native tongue through the Fort Mojave Language Recovery Program, where she works with its last remaining speakers. In September of 2020, the Metropolitan Museum appointed Patricia Norby as the museum's inaugural associate curator of Native American art. Patricia holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities with a specialization in Native American art history and visual culture. She also has an MFA in printmaking and photography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Dr. Norby previously served as senior executive and assistant director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in New York, and as director of the Darcy McNichol Center for the American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry in Chicago. She brings extensive teaching experience to the Met and is in her new role at the Met. She will work on collection development and exhibition programming that places Native arts in the focus and in dialogue with culturally diverse production. She also will oversee the formation of long-term partnerships and reciprocity with Indigenous American communities, scholars, artists, and audiences in the region and across the country. So new programs have been created to better prepare Native cultural workers to rise and lead in the arts and cultural sector. One such program is the Borderlands Fellowship. So this fellowship pairs the distinct institutional resources of the Vera List Center in New York City and the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University to support research projects that create communities across different geographical, cultural, and political landscapes. It focuses on the relevance of place and supports the application of an Indigenous lens to reflect on questions of borderlands. So guided by the vision and principles articulated by the co-director, Natalie Diaz, who I previously shared, the initiative provides an arc of joint research, encounters, and experiences set in motion by two related research projects on notions of borders and place. So Diaz describes the project as looking at the borderlands through an Indigenous lens to center the people's connection to the land and waters, to what exists beneath and around the man-made borders, and the connections to the body, language, ceremony that honors both autonomy and our relationship to one another as peoples and to non-human living beings. So Borderland Fellows are selected by a panel from a pool of invited applicants, and the fellows each receive a research award of $15,000 for the 2-year cycle and spend time together as well as independently, both in Tempe, Arizona, and in New York City over the 4 semesters. The outcome of their research will be presented at both locations and will be curatorially and financially supported by the 2 host institutions. So the first 2 fellows selected are artist Maria Hupfield and artist Carolina Quesedo, and their fellowships will run through the spring of 2022, I believe. So the final recommendation from the convening pertains to the need to better resource Native artists and Native-led organizations. The desire is to see more and larger funding opportunities for Native artists and their creative practices, particularly those that address pressing social issues. So in addition, there is a call to advocate for Native-led systems and organizations. One organization that has developed a program to fund Native artists and culture bearers is the Indian Collective out of South Dakota. This organization is relatively new and is made up of Indigenous grassroots organizers. Their mission is dedicated to building Indigenous power through organizing, activism, philanthropy, grant making, capacity building, and narrative change. Their Changemaker Fellowship is designed to invest in the visions, leadership, and development of who they consider Indigenous change makers. Indian Collective believes that Native people have the creativity, innovation, and determination to build healthy, resilient futures, to defend their homelands and rights, to develop model regenerative nations, and to decolonize and heal their communities and families. The fellowship is open to Indigenous people over the age of 18 who are working in the defense, development, or decolonization of their communities and nations, whose vision aligns with an honoring of the interconnectedness of all things, Indigenous self-determination, and equity and justice for all people on the planet. The 12-month fellowship begins in spring of 2022 and was awarded to 21 Indigenous changemakers across the continental US and Canada and Mexico. The changemakers each received flexible cash awards of $75,000 to invest in and support their innovation as leaders. Indigenous leaders oftentimes lack the financial well-being and stability required to fully invest their time and talent in creating the social change they want to see in their communities. So Grantmakers in the Arts is the only national association and network of private, public, and corporate art funders in the US, and includes independent and family foundations, public agencies, community foundations, corporate philanthropies, nonprofit regranters, and national service organizations. They're funders of all shapes and sizes across the US and into Canada. GIA provides leadership and professional development for arts grantmakers through their conferences and workshops, webinars and publications, through research and policy work all across the field of philanthropy, and utilizing online communication tools. With a change in leadership in 2017, the organization has deepened their commitment to equity and diversity. It's evident in their board development and the appointment of 3 directors that represent Native communities. So these Native board members are now seated at a table with influential decision makers who control resources for the arts and culture sector. They have the ability to influence philanthropic policy and address barriers that Native artists, culture bearers, and arts organizations face. So after an extensive strategic planning process, the Native Arts and Cultures, went too fast. The Native Arts and Cultures Foundation redesigned their grant making programs to be more responsive to the ways that Native artists are currently working within their communities. Sorry, it keeps advancing on its own. The Shift Advancing Social Change program is designed to embolden Native voices and allow for artists and partner organizations to consider more expansive projects that benefit Native communities while driving critical conversations on national and global issues. Native artists from around the country will be supported in the development and production of large-scale projects across multiple disciplines that explore some of the most pressing issues of our time, including the environment, culture, and colonization. So 15 projects were selected for the program's 2021 inaugural year, and each received a 2-year grant of $100,000. Half of the award is required to go directly to the artist to support their practice and living expenses. And in addition to the monetary award, they also receive support in professional development, communications and marketing, as well as networking and exhibiting and presenting their works. So earlier I spoke briefly about Native Arts and Cultures Foundation's changing scope as a result of an unprecedented gift of a building in the Portland metro area. This rematriation of space speaks to the advocacy of Native Arts and Cultures Foundation and allies to better support Native-led arts and cultures organizations. The Yale Union is a historic building located in the southeast portion of Portland, and it's owned and operated. It was owned and operated by a contemporary art center of the same name for about 10 years. And the organization had decided to dissolve the nonprofit and close their business a few years ago. So as an act of repatriation and recognition of the fact that the land on which the building is located was taken from Native peoples, the organization made the bold and extraordinary move to transfer ownership of the building to the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. In February of this year, we received title to the building and renamed it the Center for Native Arts and Cultures. So the vision for the space includes a 99-seat black box theater, exhibition space, space for classes and community meetings, places for cultural ceremonies and celebrations, all of which will work to create a vibrant gathering space for Indigenous artists and the broader community. So we are currently engaging community around the design and usage of the space and plan to begin renovations in the fall of 2023 with a grand reopening in the beginning of 2025. So before opening it up to Q&A, I wanted to end the presentation by sharing some of the reflections that folks had who attended the Native Arts and Cultures Resilience, Reclamation, and Relevance convening. So Crystal Echohawk, who was the author or the leader behind the illuminative report, says, our most revolutionary acts as Native peoples to fight racism is being visible. Through our art, through our words, through our images, through our standing up and fighting for policies today. Shelley Lowe, the new chair of the NEH, says, we have to figure out how to break down these structures, dismantle them, and reassemble them in ways that really do help us continue to live the arts and humanities lives that we live in. And finally, the incredible poet Joy Harjo says, the arts, cultures, and humanities of this land, this place that we call the United States, are ingrained in the ageless depths of this land and its original people, and have continued to be sown in profound layers of influence that have been introduced by immigrants of every continent and nearly every world culture. So again, I want to thank you for joining us and allowing me the opportunity to share some of the incredible activities that are happening in Indian country and arts and cultures. And I'm welcome to take any questions and share additional information with any of you now.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that with us. I think there's really a lot there to think about and to continue to strive towards. Yeah, I would encourage anybody, if you have any questions, you can use the chat function. You can put comments or questions in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature, and we can call on you directly in that way. Since I don't see any questions immediately, I thought I might kick us off with a question, Barbara. I was wondering if you have any advice or what kind of suggestions you would give for maybe arts or culture organizations that do not have a history of intentionally supporting Native arts and Native artists, but are perhaps interested in taking some first steps towards that kind of a relationship. What do you have any like first steps or suggestions for that? It's kind of a big question, but
yeah, sure. It's all relational. It's really important to build authentic relationships, especially with the Native communities who have a history of of being tokenized often. So my advice has always been to, be very sincere, work to build relationships, bring Native voices to the table as early as possible. They should be part of the planning and design of anything that you're doing that involves them. I know it's very frustrating for Native people who are often called in to do a last minute land acknowledgement or a prayer, that type of thing. And there's just so much talent and knowledge in Indian country that could support the development of programs and really enhance the environment of any arts and cultures or any institution at all. So that would be my advice, but also knowing that it takes time to build those relationships and to kind of navigate through the mistrust that's inherent in that. So not to be discouraged and spend a lot of time listening and allowing people to voice. Sometimes they're challenging, hard conversations that you have to work through, but they're necessary in order to build those strong relationships and effective partnerships.
thank you. Bruce, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, Barbara, thank you so much. That was really illuminating and inspiring. And I guess I have two thoughts. Is, where are you getting all the money to do these wonderful projects at your institution? And then the other one is just a thought. In your experience, is there a state art agency that is doing really well in supporting native arts?
Oh, well, I'll take the first question. For Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, after the events in 2020, we saw a shift in philanthropy. There tends to be these kinds of ebbs and flows and trends in giving. And with the pandemic and with George Floyd, there seems to be a deeper investment in Indigenous and Black communities. So our fundraising this past year was probably triple of what we've normally experienced. So that has helped us in our planning for this building for on taking real estate. We're also embarking upon a capital campaign, and that will help us with the renovation. For other organizations, I think they're experiencing the same thing. I know Indian Collective is a very new institution or organization that came out of kind of everything that took place at Standing Rock. And they too have been experiencing an influx of funding, and they're very skilled and knowledgeable about how to navigate, especially federal funding. So there's money out there. It's just getting the right team together in order to identify and go after those funds. And then, we've always been kind of scrappy and able to work with our communities to get donations and things like that. So I think there's still that grassroots kind of effort to raise funds. And, arts communities are very creative and resourceful and are able to do a lot with a little. And I think they're often not given enough credit for that too. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of resources. Our organization, as well as Indian Collective, are recipients of the Mackenzie Scott philanthropic efforts. So there was quite a few of us in the Native kind of arts and cultural scene that received those supports too. Hopefully that trend will continue, and it won't be kind of a fleeting effort. And what was your second question? I know that was a tougher question.
Yeah, this might not be one you want to tackle, but I just wondered if is there a state arts agency that's doing a really good job in supporting Native arts?
I am not aware of anything offhand within my experience, and in California as well as now in Oregon. I would make an assumption that maybe arts councils that are located in a higher populated, Native populated area might have more of a reach, such as maybe Arizona, but then those states generally don't have a lot of funding either. So that's something I think to look into, and I don't have an answer for you, specific answer. Thank you though for your questions.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So, well, more of a statement actually. I really like how you said for different programs or entities to involve Native people in the community from the get-go, because I think what happens too often, what I've seen as a Native artist, is that especially around Native American Heritage Month or Day, people want to put in, they want to do a Native show or a Native speaker, and it's kind of last minute, and it's kind of like, okay, we'll do this, but then you don't hear from them for the rest of the year. So I think that's really important to be consistent of inclusion of Native communities, whether it's the arts community or education or whatever that is. So that's something I agree with you on, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Also, I'd like to ask you a question about, are there any current bills being introduced for infusing educational curriculum with Native arts? I mean, it's really hard to expand the art department in schools already, but then to infuse that with native arts, I'm sure that's a battle. And do you see anything happening there?
Yeah, I think part of the conversations that took place at the convening in DC were around kind of a dedicated funding stream at the federal level for the arts. I think that is a desire that's been shared for many years. So I think the relevance of Shelley Lowe and some of these other folks that are in these leadership positions hopefully will help push that conversation forward, and that we'll see some real significant changes. But I know that's a desire that's been shared by the community at large. So, it's a slow moving train, especially when you're on the federal level. But hopefully all of the pieces are in place that will go forward. Locally, I know that we're working to, Oregon's got a unique way of addressing funding in sort of a communal type way where folks will submit a proposal and then they advocate a packet to the legislators at the state level. So hopefully we'll see more Native organizations in that kind of packet, and we'll see a larger influx that are based on bond measures, I believe. So hopefully keep your fingers crossed, keep pushing and advocating, and hopefully we see some real substantial change.
Yes.
And it's November, so you'll be very busy this month, as we all are.
Hunter, you have your hand raised and a question in the chat. So
I do. Hello. First, I want to thank Barbara for sharing her insights, and I think it's a really beautiful way to demonstrate reciprocity throughout Indigenous communities. And so I want to thank you first for giving us the opportunity to share what you are doing, and then figuring out ways that this collective can support the work that you do. I think oftentimes noted in what Al had said is that there's this tokenization and commodification of Indigenous cultures around certain holidays. And I think there's opportunities for Indigenous people to step up and take the reins on a lot of this work, and for us to demonstrate the way that actionable cause can happen. And so I think that's really beautiful. So thank you. And then the second part I wanted to ask is, you spoke about the 2022 biannual convening. Will that be invite only, or is that an opportunity for all people to join? Because I work in museums, and I'm an Indigenous museum curator, and I think there'd definitely be a place for us in something like that. So
For sure. Thank you for all of that insight and being here. Yes, the convening is open. We are prioritizing artists and arts and cultural workers, looking at different ways to offset the costs for those folks like yourself that are working in the field. But it will be open to the broader communities. So if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up for it, and you'll be notified when all of that comes around. And you can always shoot me an email as well if you're interested in being more involved in that process, because we are looking for volunteers and all of that. So you're welcome to join us. And thank you for your work too that you're doing. What museum do you work with?
I work at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming.
Great. Okay.
So I'm Crow and Yakima, but I work with the collections of people, predominantly of the Plains. And so those are the tribes that were there prior to colonization, and the tribes forcibly there because of colonization. And so we define that as the Saskatchewan River in Canada down to the Rio Grande. And so we have about 10,000 collections. We're governed by an advisory board, or we have a board of trustees and an advisory board that's predominantly Native led, and then we have our collections, but we have collections from all over the United States. And so I see myself as a steward, just the caretaker for now. These collections will always belong to their people, and I'm just the caretaker right now. So, I work pretty closely with the Shoshone and Arapaho people as well, because although I'm Crow and Cody is one of our ancestral territories, this is their land right now. And so we work pretty closely with the Business Council, and we have tribal representation. And it's beautiful work, but again, in 2020 and 2019, it's been wearing work. There's a lot of light brought on DEAI related content and things that I think Indigenous communities have always been doing, but we seem to be on the cusp of a lot of other institutions. And so I worked really closely with the Wyoming Arts Council. We've got some grants that we developed, actually with Josh, and then I've done some fellowship work with the Arts Council. And so it's beautiful to come full circle again.
Great. Well, thank you for that work. That's hard work. Thank you.
Yeah, we relied pretty heavily on Hunter as we were developing the Native Art Fellowship at the Wyoming Arts Council. She really gave us a lot of invaluable support. So thank you, Hunter. We still have about 12 minutes. So if anybody else has more questions, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, or speak up. While we're waiting for more questions to pop up, Barbara, I was wondering if you had any specific resources that you would point people towards who are interested in learning more. Of course, the report that you were speaking about, the Resilience, Reclamation and Relevance report, I think that's available on your website. You also mentioned the Reclaiming Native Truth report that First Nations Development Institute created, which is on their website. Do you have other resources you would point people towards?
Sure. I'm not sure if the PowerPoint will be made available to those. There are embedded websites in the PowerPoint itself, but yes, First Nations Development Institute, Illuminative is another great resource, Indian Collective. A lot of the information can be found on our website as well. There are a handful of organizations that have been stepping up in this last couple of years. Decolonizing Wealth is another good resource to look at, especially from the philanthropic sector, and how funding is shifting, or the approach of funding is kind of decolonizing that method. But those are kind of the main organizations that I would suggest looking into. And then probably just keeping aware of changes that are happening at the NEA and the NEH. A lot of this momentum that's taking place, the kind of listening tours that they're doing, I assume will result in some sort of comprehensive report, which is how government agencies generally work. And so hopefully with Shelley Lowe and all of the other great leaders that we see rising kind of to the top, we'll see more evidence and information coming out.
Awesome, thank you for that. And I will try to send out a copy of the PowerPoint to attendees here. We ran into an issue earlier in the week. We were trying to pull a report to gather the email addresses, and so we haven't quite figured it out. But I will try to do that, and we can make the PowerPoint available. Sure. Website or some other way if we can't figure that out.
I can always put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants it, I can always send it out as well.
Great.
Yeah, I think to kind of go back to what Al and Hunter were saying, it's you can't say it enough that the month of November tends to be kind of a time of the year that we're both, we both feel honored, but we also feel very stretched thin and tokenized at times. So just a reminder to everyone to take it easy on your native folks this month, and try to think of ways to engage them beyond November, having those conversations. I know in California, I assume throughout the nation, conversations around the land acknowledgements has been another area that has been both illuminating and honoring, but also very taxing for Native communities, trying to identify kind of the right people to speak about the territory that you're in. And generally that's, a small group of people that have either the bandwidth or connection and that type of thing that can help with those. And they tend to be very, the stress, the feeling a need of being there to support and ensuring that accuracy is happening. But at the same time, a lot of them have their full-time jobs and family responsibilities. So that's why it's, I think, really important to think beyond November, think larger, and how to embed those conversations more deeply.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great, a great thing for us to keep in mind as we're working towards this. I don't think we have any more questions that are coming up, so we might. Oh, actually, looks like
great, Stacy.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my kids are sleeping, so I'm like walking around outside. Yeah, so I'm part of, I just started a new group here in Lander, Wyoming with a few other women called the Bossert Collective, and we're focused on bringing culturally relevant and like sort of historically enlightening public art to Lander. And our big project right now is involving 2 Native American artists from the Wind River Reservation, Colleen Friday and Celissa Abeda. So Colleen is Northern Arapaho and Celissa is Eastern Shoshone. And so we're working on this huge mural. They're working on the mock-up right now, and I'm grant writing like crazy to get funding for it, obviously, which isn't hard. Like you said, there's so much interest right